Welcome to Frank's Fables. Jake Carter had never run so fast in his life. His heart pounded, and his throat felt raw from the frantic dash. He clutched his phone tightly, the screen showing a single blurry photograph he had managed to snap in that dimly lit warehouse. His sneakers kicked up loose gravel as he barreled toward Officer Grant Barber, a man whose face he recognized from community events and safety assemblies at school. Jake's hoodie was damp from sweat and the crisp twilight air, and his lungs burned with every breath. All the while, an image replayed in his head: frightened faces, hands tied, and the harsh sound of men shouting. He had to tell someone, anyone, before those people vanished forever. Grant Barber looked at the teen with a practiced mixture of concern and composure. The officer's dark hair was cropped close, and he had kind eyes, or so most people believed. He was in his late 30s, with an athletic build that gave the impression he could handle any problem that came his way. In their small town of Havenport, he was well known, always stopping by local festivals and greeting folks by name. People trusted him. Jake, desperately trying to catch his breath, saw the officer's eyebrows draw together in a serious frown. "Slow down, son," Grant said. "Take a deep breath. Now tell me what's going on." Jake gulped and wiped sweat off his brow. "There's men in the abandoned warehouse off Greenwood Road," he managed. "They have people tied up. Dozens of them. I took pictures, but—" He tried to steady his breathing, but his panic overwhelmed him, and it took all his willpower just to form a coherent sentence. "They had guns. They were talking about moving them tomorrow morning. And I saw them hurting people." Grant's expression darkened in an instant. For a split second, Jake believed it was out of genuine concern, but the truth was more complicated. At that moment, from Jake's perspective, it seemed the officer was about to rush off and call for backup. Instead, Grant drew a breath and spoke in a measured tone. "Let me see that photo," Grant said quietly. Jake, relieved to be heard, thrust out his phone. He still shook with adrenaline, but he managed to pull up the blurry image. It showed dim light filtering through gaps in the warehouse walls and shadowy forms of people sitting on the floor, their hands visibly restrained. A tall man with a rifle stood in the corner. "Okay," Grant muttered, scanning the screen. "We need to do this carefully, Jake. Show me where this place is. Can you walk me through what you saw?" The officer's voice was calm and controlled. Jake nodded, feeling the edges of his terror soften. He described how he'd been walking home along Greenwood Road when he noticed flickering lights through the broken wooden slats of the old warehouse. Nobody had used that building in years. Everyone in town said it was a relic from a failed shipping company. Jake had gone closer out of curiosity, which he now regretted, but he never imagined stumbling onto something so horrific. "I'm so sorry," Jake said, voice trembling. I should have called 911 straight away, but I was afraid they'd hear me. Then I remembered you lived nearby, or at least you patrolled here. I just didn't know what else to do." Grant pressed his lips into a thin line. Jake saw the reflection of the phone screen in the officer's eyes. "You did the right thing coming to me," Grant replied, though something about his voice struck Jake as unnervingly flat. "We're going to handle this." Jake felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," he whispered. He was about to ask if they needed more backup, maybe the entire Havenport Police Department, but then he froze. A strange tension gripped the air around them. Grant's gaze drifted from the phone screen to Jake's pale face. Instead of calling for backup, he quietly turned off the phone's display and slipped it into his pocket. "You said there's a group of armed men in that warehouse?" Grant asked, his tone still controlled. "Human trafficking? That's what you think is happening there?" Jake nodded vigorously. "I saw people with their hands tied behind their backs. They looked terrified. A man in charge said they were leaving at dawn. I heard him say something about no loose ends. I got so scared." Grant exhaled slowly. "All right. I'll check this out myself. But I need you to stay put. Understand? If these men are as dangerous as you say, we can't have you running around." Jake hesitated. "Stay put?" he repeated. "Shouldn't we get more officers?" Shouldn't you call your station? Grant forced a quick, reassuring smile. Procedures, kid. We can't spook them. Follow me to my patrol car, and I'll radio dispatch. Jake nodded. Sure. His heart still hammered with fear, but he was so relieved at the possibility of rescue for those people in the warehouse that he didn't notice the subtle flicker in Grant's eyes or the tightening of the officer's jaw. Jake allowed himself to be led to Grant's patrol car, parked just under a flickering street lamp. The chirp of crickets seemed louder than usual, as if they, too, sensed the dread in the air. Grant opened the passenger door. Hop in, he said. I'll turn on the radio once we're both inside. Jake slid onto the seat, placed his hands on his knees, and tried to still his trembling. He hoped his mother wouldn't worry too much about him being late. Normally, he'd be home by now. Angela Carter, his mother, was protective ever since her husband, Officer Logan Carter, had died under suspicious circumstances 3 months earlier. Everyone said it was a line-of-duty tragedy, but the investigation never turned up the killers. Now, Jake had stumbled onto something monstrous. Maybe solving this case would help him cope with his father's death, or so he told himself in an attempt to quell the swirling chaos in his mind. Grant settled into the driver's seat and closed the door, making sure the windows were up. For a moment, he studied Jake's face in the dim glow of the overhead light. Jake noticed something about Grant's posture that set off an alarm in his head. Then Grant reached toward the dashboard, fiddled with the radio, and turned it off. Jake's eyes widened. What are you doing? Grant's next move was swift. He lunged across the seat, one hand reaching for the back of Jake's head, the other pressing something cold and hard into Jake's temple. Jake realized with horror that it was a small handgun. It had come from Grant's holster so fast, he hadn't even seen it until it was too late. I'm sorry, kid, Grant whispered. But you saw something you shouldn't have. Jake gasped. He fumbled at the door handle, but Grant was stronger and quicker. The officer snatched Jake's wrist in an iron grip. Jake's phone, his only proof, was in Grant's pocket. His heart pounded so violently that he could barely hear anything but its hammering. Terror flooded his veins. He had never been in such immediate danger, and certainly never expected it would be from a man with a badge he once trusted. Let go! Jake cried. He tried to twist away. Grant pressed him harder against the seat. Quiet, he growled. You think you're some hero, investigating a major operation all by yourself? This is bigger than you. You got me mixed up in something that won't end well for either of us. Jake blinked tears away, fear and anger colliding inside him. You're in on it? He choked out. How could you? But the words caught in his throat. He recalled images of his father's funeral, the crisp folded flag handed to his mother, and this man, Grant, standing somberly in uniform, expressing condolences. The idea that Grant was behind such horrible crimes felt impossible, like some twisted nightmare. Grant's mouth curled into a grimace. You're the one who showed me the evidence. Sorry, kid. But I can't have you running around telling people. Jake's mind raced, searching for any possible escape. The patrol car's interior was cramped. The only door unlocked was the driver's side, which Grant blocked with his body. In a burst of pure desperation, Jake slammed his free elbow into Grant's shoulder. The blow was awkward but managed to knock the officer off balance for half a second. You little! Grant snarled. He regained his grip, his strength overwhelming Jake's. Panic surged through Jake's chest. He was 14, up against a grown man who was well trained in subduing suspects. The chance of escaping by brute force was slim. Yet something in Jake refused to submit entirely. He heard his father's voice in his head, the lessons Logan had taught him about never giving up, even in the face of impossible odds. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jake balled his hand into a fist and swung at Grant's jaw. Grant jerked backward, cursing, but his retaliation was immediate. He forced Jake's arm behind his back in a painful grip, then used his forearm to strike Jake's temple. Jake's head reeled from the impact. The world blurred, and the edges of his vision darkened. Not another move, Grant hissed, eyes flashing. I tried to be gentle, but you had to go and fight." With the gun still pressed to Jake's side, he forced the boy out of the patrol car. The street light above flickered like a failing beacon, revealing only flashes of their struggle. Jake's mind screamed for help, for someone, anyone, to see what was happening. But the surrounding homes seemed tucked in for the night. Porches were dark. No one was around to witness the betrayal taking place just a few steps from a quiet suburban street. "Let me go," Jake demanded, though his voice shook with tears. He tried to twist his arm free, but pain shot down his shoulder. He felt physically and emotionally cornered, robbed of all sense of safety. Grant began to drag him toward a cluster of nearby trees that lined the street. The officer paused, looking around for a place to stash the frantic teenager. But time was slipping away. Someone might drive by or come outside to walk a dog. Cursing under his breath, Grant glanced at Jake's phone again. The single photo Jake had taken remained on the screen, the only visible proof of the warehouse's terrible secret. Jake coughed as he tried to talk. You were my dad's friend," he managed. "He trusted you." Grant's eyes flickered with annoyance, and something like guilt, but it quickly vanished into cold calculation. "Your father was a fool," he said. "Always poking around, trying to dig up big cases. Got himself killed. You don't want to end up like him." For a heartbeat, Jake felt the entire world tilt under his feet. Something in Grant's words implied far more knowledge about Logan Carter's death than Jake had ever realized. He had believed for so long that his father died chasing a suspect in a routine traffic stop that went wrong. But the revelation in Grant's tone, he sounded almost proud that Logan was gone. Jake choked on rage. You had something to do with my dad's death?" Grant glared at him but didn't answer. Instead, he clamped a hand around Jake's neck. "We're done talking." Jake's fingers scrambled for a hold on Grant's wrist, but the man was too strong. A swirling darkness filled Jake's vision as his airway constricted. He managed to scratch at Grant's forearm, but the officer only tightened his grip. Jake's last conscious thought was that he had failed those people in the warehouse. He couldn't stop this monster. Then everything went black. Hours later, a jogger named Troy Mason found Jake half buried in a shallow ditch under some brush and loose gravel. The early morning sun was only beginning to warm the horizon, yet Troy always took his pre-dawn run. He spotted what looked like a sneaker sticking out. Confused and worried, he crept closer. His heart lurched when he saw Jake's battered face, dirt smeared across the boy's cheek, and no sign of movement. Troy fumbled for his phone to dial 911, voice shaking as he explained the situation. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, their ambulance lights illuminating the otherwise tranquil morning. They lifted Jake onto a stretcher, checking his vital signs. He was alive, though unconscious, with a nasty bruise on his temple and abrasions on his arms. Angela Carter got the call just after sunup. She rushed to the hospital, tears in her eyes, her hands trembling. For 3 months she had been struggling to cope with her husband's suspicious death, juggling her job at a local bakery, and raising Jake alone. This was a nightmare made real. She burst into the hospital's emergency ward, frantically scanning for her son. "Where is he?" she demanded of a nurse, voice high with panic. The nurse guided her to a curtained bed where Jake lay, pale and still. A drip was attached to his arm, and his head was bandaged. Angela sank into the chair beside him, her heart pounding. "Jake," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She smoothed back his hair, remembering a million little moments, his shy smile, his warm hugs, the way he tried to be brave after losing his dad. She leaned over his still form. "Please, baby, please wake up." Doctors arrived and explained that Jake had suffered a head injury and might not regain consciousness for hours or even days. They had run scans to check for internal bleeding. While the situation was serious, they assured her that nothing indicated permanent brain damage. For Angela, it was little comfort. Another part of her world was hanging in the balance. As she sat there, memories of Logan flooded back, the day he proposed at the fall carnival, the moment they found out Angela was pregnant, and the pride in his eyes when he held newborn Jake for the first time. She remembered his unwavering sense of duty and how it drove him to protect the people of Havenport, sometimes at the expense of his own safety. And now her son lay in a hospital bed, apparently the victim of a random mugging or accident. She wasn't convinced. The circumstances felt off, especially because Jake wasn't the type to wander into the rough parts of town. He typically came straight home after hanging out with friends. Officer Grant Barber showed up at the hospital not long after, wearing a stoic expression. He approached Angela, nodding somberly. "I heard what happened," Grant said. "We got a call about a teenager found unconscious in a ditch. I didn't realize it was Jake until we ran the name. I'm so sorry. We'll do everything we can to catch whoever did this." Angela sniffed, wiping her red eyes. "He's still unconscious," she said. "The doctors think they're not sure when he'll wake up." Grant patted her shoulder, a gesture that made her stomach churn for reasons she couldn't name. He looked around the hospital corridor, lowering his voice. "Do you have any idea why Jake might have been out near Greenwood Road last night?" Angela shook her head. "No. He told me he was just going to a friend's house. He was supposed to be home by 9. Grant nodded slowly. "I'll be in touch. If Jake wakes up and recalls anything at all, any detail, it might help us find the culprit." Angela swallowed hard. "Sure," she whispered, though a strange unease crept through her. Something about Grant's eyes looked different. Or perhaps it was her grief twisting her perceptions. After all, she had always respected Grant, regarded him as a close friend of her husband. Over the next couple of days, Angela stayed at the hospital full-time, hardly sleeping. Friends from the neighborhood stopped by with flowers and words of comfort. Every time someone mentioned the mugger, Angela would nod, but she couldn't shake the gut feeling that something bigger was at play. She thought of Logan's final weeks. He had been anxious then, telling her only bits and pieces about a big investigation that would change everything in Havenport. "I can't discuss details," Logan had said gently, "but I have to see this through." And then he was dead, gunned down after calling in a tip about suspicious activity near the docks. Angela inhaled slowly, trying to clear the swirl of doubts in her mind. She brushed her fingers over Jake's hand, feeling how cold it was. "I can't lose you too," she whispered. Each beep of the hospital monitor felt like a ticking clock, reminding her that time was everything. She needed Jake to wake up. She needed him to tell her what happened. Only then could she decide what to do next. That same night, hidden behind the veneer of a quiet hospital, two shadowy figures slipped in through a back entrance. Their steps were measured, their faces partially hidden beneath black hoodies. They avoided the main corridors, heading straight to the wing where Jake was recovering. One of them carried a small syringe, the other a suppressed pistol. They had been sent to tie off a loose end. Angela had dozed off in a chair beside Jake's bed, exhaustion winning out after hours of vigilance. The whir of the floor pump and the steady beep of the monitor lulled her into a restless sleep. In the hallway, the overhead lights flickered. A nurse passed by on her rounds, almost spotting the intruders, but they melted into a supply closet at just the right moment. Once the nurse turned the corner, they continued. Jake's room was at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar. They peered inside. It was dim. Angela was slouched in her chair. Jake lay unmoving in bed. The assassin with the syringe nodded to his partner, who stepped forward with near-silent footsteps. Just then, a squeak from the hallway caught their attention, a hospital janitor wheeling a mop bucket. They flattened themselves against the wall, out of sight, until the janitor pushed the bucket into an adjacent room. At that same instant Jake stirred. His eyes opened for just a moment, unfocused and glassy. He let out a soft moan, his mind swimming in a haze of confusion. Angela snapped awake, the slight movement rousing her. She sat forward. "Jake?" she whispered urgently, leaning over him. "Jake, can you hear me?" The intruders listened from outside the door. They realized their window of opportunity was closing. The one with the syringe gripped it tightly, stepping forward, but at that precise moment, a nurse arrived at the nurse's station just down the hall. The men exchanged tense looks. Going in now risked being caught in the act. They retreated into the shadows, cursing under their breath as they fled. This was the second time that unexpected complications spoiled their mission. They hurried out through the same back exit, leaving no trace except the uneasy feeling that someone had been near. Inside Jake's room, Angela cradled her son's head with trembling hands. "Jake, it's okay," she whispered, blinking tears of relief that he was beginning to wake. "I'm here." Jake tried to speak but could only manage a strained exhalation. His eyes fluttered shut again, and the nurse came in, checking his vitals. "He's still weak," the nurse said kindly. "But this is a good sign." Angela nodded, feeling a strange prickle on the back of her neck, as though the room's atmosphere carried a hint of menace. She glanced toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. The hallway was empty. She shook off the feeling, blaming her frayed nerves and lack of sleep. The next day, Jake's condition improved enough that he could open his eyes and speak in whispers. Angela was overjoyed, clasping his hand with tears in her eyes, but she also sensed the fear still lingering in her son. Every time a hospital staffer entered the room, Jake would tense, as though bracing for an attack. "Jake," Angela said softly, "it's just me and you right now. Can you tell me what happened?" Jake swallowed, shifting uncomfortably on the pillow. "Mom," he murmured, "it was Grant." Angela's eyebrows shot up. She leaned closer, not sure she had heard correctly. "Grant? Officer Barber?" Jake's voice trembled. "I saw something in the old warehouse. People tied up, men with guns. I took pictures on my phone. I ran into Grant, thought he could help. But he turned on me. Took my phone. Hit me. He threatened to kill me." For several seconds, Angela couldn't breathe. She remembered Grant's solicitous tone and his vow to find the culprit. The pieces of a terrible puzzle began clicking together. Her heart thundered in her chest. "Are you sure?" she asked, even though a gut feeling told her it was true. "Jake, that's a serious accusation." Jake winced as he tried to sit up. "I'm sure. I saw the look on his face. He's part of the reason those people are in the warehouse. He destroyed my phone and left me in a ditch to die. He said something about Dad, like Dad found out something he shouldn't have. Mom, I think he's the reason Dad was killed." Angela shut her eyes, trying to stem the wave of horror washing over her. But shock hardened into resolve. "We can't go to the local police," she said, her voice trembling. "Grant controls them, or at least enough of them that we won't be safe." Jake nodded. He bit his lip, tears forming. "Dad was investigating something big before he died. All he told me was that it might fix our city if he could uncover it. I didn't know he was up against Grant. I didn't know it was so dangerous." Angela clutched Jake's hand. "We'll figure this out. I'll find a way." She reached for her phone and, with shaking fingers, dialed a number she'd been given a few years ago, Robert Hamilton, the mayor of Havenport. He had been a close friend of Logan's, always praising Logan's integrity. If there was anyone outside the police department who might help, it was the mayor. She explained the situation in a hushed voice, keeping an eye on the corridor in case Grant appeared. "Angela," Mayor Hamilton said soberly, "this is grave. If Grant truly is involved in a trafficking ring, we can't trust the local department. I'm calling in the FBI. Stay at the hospital, keep Jake safe. No one is to know he's awake." Angela's voice cracked. "Thank you, Robert. Please hurry." Word spread fast. Within 24 hours, a small team of FBI agents, led by Agent Hannah Price, arrived in Havenport. Agent Price, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a quiet confidence, wasted no time setting up a secure post at the hospital to protect Jake. She met Angela in the waiting area outside Jake's room. "I'm sorry for your family's ordeal," Price said gently, extending a handshake. "We're here to help." Angela sized her up, noticing the determined set of her jaw. "My husband was killed," Angela said, voice taut. "They told me it was a random shootout, but now Jake says Grant Barber was behind it. You have to stop him. Price nodded. If the evidence points that way, we will. Has Jake said anything else? Angela explained everything Jake remembered, how he stumbled upon the warehouse, the photos he managed to take, and how Grant attacked him. Price listened intently, taking notes. Then she looked at Angela. Mrs. Carter, she said, I need you to trust me. We'll protect Jake, but we also need to gather concrete evidence against Grant. We need to be sure he can't slip away or claim innocence. She lowered her voice. He's apparently more cunning than anyone realized. It's going to take a coordinated effort. I understand, Angela said. I'll do whatever it takes. That same evening, Price visited Jake, who was resting in his bed, still weak but clear-headed. She asked him everything he could recall, from the men's clothing to the layout of the warehouse. Jake described the crates stacked in corners, the foreign labels, the overhead catwalk where he saw a man with a rifle. He remembered hearing them say, "No loose ends," and how they planned to move out at dawn. "Jake," Price said, "the local police might still be compromised. We need your help to identify who's loyal to Grant. But you can't do this alone. You'll remain here under guard." Jake nodded, swallowing hard. A flicker of relief crossed his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I was so scared no one would believe me." Price smiled gently. "I believe you. Now we need to bring the truth to light." Across town, Grant Barber felt the walls closing in. He overheard rumors of the FBI arrival, though the precise nature of the investigation was unclear. When he attempted to check on Jake at the hospital, he found armed federal agents stationed near the boy's room. That alone told Grant everything he needed to know. The boy survived, and he must have talked. Tension coiled in Grant's chest. He had worked too hard and for too long to let a teenage kid ruin everything. He met with his accomplices in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Havenport. It was 3 a.m, and the place was empty except for the bartender who was paid to keep silent. A half-dozen men leaned around a corner table, their expressions grim. "You said the kid was taken care of," one of them hissed. He was a broad-shouldered man with a scar running across his eyebrow. Grant scowled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I left him out cold. Must have had more luck than I thought. Now the FBI is here, sniffing around. We need to clear out. The big stash in the second warehouse has to be moved. I want it gone by tomorrow night." Another man leaned in, voice low and seething. "What about the Carter boy? Or the mother? You know they won't stop." Grant's eyes gleamed dangerously. "We'll handle them. Keep pressure on them if needed. Send a message if they get too close." Meanwhile, Agent Price and her team mobilized. Over the next few days, they combed through city records and discovered a suspicious number of cases that Grant had handled, cases involving drug trafficking, missing persons, and even potential human trafficking leads that never went anywhere. It all suggested a pattern. Grant was burying investigations, funneling evidence to keep certain criminals out of the spotlight. Even more alarming were old documents tied to Officer Logan Carter. It appeared Logan had quietly been gathering intelligence, including notes about an inside man at the precinct. There were references to shipments passing through Havenport's old warehouses after midnight, involving large sums of cash. Then the notes ended abruptly, shortly before Logan was killed. Armed with these findings, Price and her team decided to raid the warehouse Jake had originally stumbled upon. To maintain secrecy, they involved only a small number of federal agents, arriving at midnight in unmarked vans. However, when they swept through the warehouse, they found it nearly empty, just a few scattered crates, some scraps of rope on the floor, and a faint chemical odor lingering in the air. "They cleaned the place out," one agent remarked, shining a flashlight across the dark interior. "Somebody tipped them off." Price's face hardened. "They're onto us. Let's see if they left behind anything we can use." In a corner, they found half-burned documents in a metal barrel, a few pages with shipping dates still legible. It appeared the operation had relocated to a larger site near the neighboring city. Price snapped pictures, bagging the fragments as evidence. The criminals, no doubt guided by Grant, had moved quickly. Back at the hospital, Angela clutched a hot cup of coffee, staring at the swirl of cream. Jake had finally drifted to sleep. The hallway felt cold despite the steady hum of heaters. When a nurse approached and gently informed her that she had a phone call, Angela's hand trembled. Who could be calling her at this hour? She answered with a wary, "Hello?" A deep voice spoke, muffled and distorted. "Stay out of this. We don't want to hurt you or the kid, but if you stick your nose where it doesn't belong, there'll be consequences." Angela's heart clenched. She recognized the menace behind those words. Grant's men, or perhaps Grant himself, was threatening her. She hung up, her knuckles white. For a moment, fear rooted her in place, but then rage ignited in her chest. Her entire family had been targeted and destroyed by these monsters. She refused to cower. Jake woke early the next morning, still weary but determined. Angela told him about the phone call. She noticed a flicker of fear in his eyes, but then he clenched his jaw, the same way Logan used to when he was resolute. "Mom," Jake said quietly, "we can't let them scare us." "Dad wouldn't." Angela brushed a hand through her son's hair. "I know," she murmured. "That's why we have to see this through." Agent Price soon appeared, her dark hair tied back in a neat bun, a serious expression on her face. She explained that they needed Jake's testimony in detail, along with anything Logan might have shared about his final investigation. Jake described a memory from the week before Logan died. He had overheard his father talking on the phone, saying something about how a friend turned out to be an enemy, and that he couldn't trust certain people at the precinct. At the time, Jake didn't understand, but now the meaning was painfully clear. "I think Dad suspected Grant for a while," Jake said. "He must have been getting too close to the truth." The agent nodded, grave. "It lines up with our evidence. Don't worry, Jake. We'll expose him." Meanwhile, Price's team kept digging, discovering a labyrinth of corruption that reached beyond Havenport. They found ties to an interstate human trafficking network. Grant, though relatively small-time in the grand scheme of organized crime, played a crucial role as law enforcement protection. He allowed criminals to move freely through the town in exchange for hefty bribes. Logan Carter had uncovered these dealings, and his murder was a direct result. Once they had enough leads, the FBI decided to strike at the new location indicated by the burnt documents. It was another warehouse on the outskirts of a much larger city. With a carefully coordinated plan, they scheduled a pre-dawn raid. This time, they aimed to be swift and silent. They would rescue the captives, seize the contraband, and gather irrefutable proof of Grant's role. Jake stayed behind, under guard, though he desperately wanted to help. Angela paced the hospital corridors, anxious for any update. The hours crawled by. Finally, near dawn, an agent called Price, relaying the outcome. They had found more than a dozen captives, half of them women and children, along with crates of weapons and other illegal materials. The men guarding them were arrested without a major shootout. It was a triumphant success in terms of rescuing victims and gathering evidence. But Grant Barber wasn't there. He had slipped away once again. In the days that followed, the rescued captives began sharing harrowing stories with the FBI. Their accounts painted Grant as a key figure, describing how he would appear in uniform to give orders, acting untouchable because of his badge. One terrified woman recalled him boasting about how nobody in Havenport would suspect a thing. Using these testimonies, Price prepared warrants for Grant's arrest. The problem was locating him. He had abandoned his house, cleaned out his bank accounts, and gone into hiding. Traces of him popped up now and then, an ATM withdrawal at a truck stop, or a security camera capturing a fleeting figure matching his description, but he remained one step ahead. Jake, now out of the hospital and recovering at home, watched the news coverage with Angela. The television flashed images of the warehouse raids, FBI statements praising the rescue of captives, and mentions of a rogue officer suspected in corruption. Angela studied Jake's face, noticing the guilt flickering there. "You did what you could," she told him gently. "You saved those people." Jake managed a small nod. "But he's still out there," he said. What if he tries something again? Angela patted his shoulder. Agent Price has assigned protection. We'll be all right. But in a secluded cabin deep within a pine forest, Grant Barber was already plotting his next move. Seated at a wobbly wooden table, he lit a cigarette and blew a stream of smoke at the dim ceiling. One of his remaining associates stood by the window, scanning the dark trees for signs of pursuit. They had brought along a terrified young girl from the warehouse, someone who had hidden away and was overlooked during the FBI raid. She was bound at the wrists, silently sobbing in the corner. Grant intended to use her as leverage if cornered. He knew the FBI's tactics. Rescuing hostages would be their top priority. Time was short. The FBI was closing in from every angle. Grant had stashed enough cash to flee the country, but he needed to ensure he could get past roadblocks, border controls, and everything else the feds would set up. The young girl was his bargaining chip, a way to force the FBI to stand down, at least long enough for him to vanish. Late that night, an FBI signal pinged. Grant's phone was momentarily active, near Pinewood Forest. Price wasted no time mobilizing a specialized unit. Their vehicles rolled onto dirt roads, headlights off, the squads communicating via encrypted radios. Angela and Jake, informed by the FBI that the net was finally closing, stayed at a safe house. Jake insisted on waiting up, anxious for any news. Grant heard the faint hum of engines in the distance and tensed. He spoke into a burner phone. They're coming. Get the girl. Let's be ready. His associate dragged the frightened girl to the cabin's center. Grant checked his gun. Within minutes, the FBI's tactical squad surrounded the cabin. Agent Price, wearing a bulletproof vest, moved to the front. She yelled out, Grant Barber, this is the FBI. We have the place surrounded. Release the hostage and come out with your hands up. Inside, Grant clenched his jaw. He dragged the girl in front of the window, letting the agent see her wide, terrified eyes. He pressed a gun to her side. Back off! He shouted, voice echoing through the pines. I'll shoot her if you try to come in. Outside, the tension was thick as the morning fog. Agent Price spoke through a megaphone. Don't do anything stupid. You won't get away with this. Grant pressed his lips into a tight line. He knew he was cornered. He barked an order to his associate to gather their things. Maybe there was a slim chance they could slip out the back, but from the shifting flashlights outside, it seemed the FBI had every angle covered. The young girl whimpered, tears streaking her cheeks. Shut it! Grant hissed at her, though his own breathing was ragged. In a single moment, the full realization of how far he had fallen seemed to weigh on him. He had enjoyed the power and money, indulged in every twisted perk of corruption. Now everything was crashing down. Outside, Price motioned to her team. A pair of agents crept around the side of the cabin, maneuvering into position. Another agent set a flash bang at the door. Price gave a short countdown. The door exploded inward with a deafening bang and a blinding flash of light. Grant shielded his face, momentarily disoriented, and fired blindly. The bullet ricocheted off the floor, sending splinters flying. In that split second, two agents lunged in through the back. They tackled Grant, forcing his gun arm to the ground. The young girl scrambled away, sobbing in relief. Grant's associate tried to bolt out a side window but was met by another agent's taser, jolting him to the floor. Get your hands behind your head! An agent roared. Grant spat out a curse, still dazed from the flashbang. The girl crouched in a corner, trembling. Another agent rushed over, gently escorting her outside, wrapping her in a jacket. She blinked in the flood of flashlight beams, tears streaming as she realized she was free. Grant Barber, pinned to the wooden floor, felt the cold grip of handcuffs tighten around his wrists. This isn't over, he growled, though the defeat in his voice was evident. His once self-assured composure had drained away. Agent Price stepped in, her expression a mixture of triumph and disgust. Grant Barber, she said, you're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, human trafficking, and the murder of Officer Logan Carter. She paused, letting the words sink in. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Grant's face twisted with anger, but he said nothing. The cabin was soon flooded with agents gathering evidence, illegal arms, ledgers, contact lists. The kidnapped girl was safely transported away to medical care. By the time dawn broke, the entire site was secured. News of Grant's arrest spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, a press conference was held, featuring FBI representatives, the mayor, and countless reporters asking questions about the shocking corruption in Havenport's police force. Agent Price maintained a measured tone, emphasizing that the FBI's operation had successfully dismantled a trafficking ring, rescuing multiple victims. She confirmed that Officer Grant Barber was not merely complicit, but a central figure who enabled criminals to move freely. Mayor Hamilton, looking grim, spoke briefly. "This is a dark day for Havenport," he said. "But we must remember that exposing corruption is the first step toward healing and rebuilding trust. I want to thank the FBI, as well as Angela Carter and her son, Jake, who bravely came forward." At the safe house, Angela and Jake watched the press conference on a small television. Jake's eyes glistened with relief when he saw images of Grant in handcuffs, being led to a black SUV. But there was also a flicker of sorrow on his face as he remembered all that had been lost, especially his father. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad would be proud of you," she said softly. "What you did saved lives." Jake exhaled shakily. "It just hurts that it took all of this. I wish Dad was here." Angela's voice trembled. "Me too," she whispered. "But at least we have some justice now." Justice came in the form of a high-profile trial. Grant Barber faced multiple charges: corruption, trafficking, kidnapping, attempted murder of a minor, and the murder of Officer Logan Carter. The prosecutors presented damning evidence, from the testimonies of rescued captives to the financial records linking Grant to major criminal organizations. Perhaps the most potent weapon in their arsenal was Jake Carter, who took the stand with quiet determination. On the day Jake testified, the courtroom was packed. Cameras were not allowed inside, but reporters lined the halls. Angela sat in the front row, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles went white. Agent Price sat beside her, offering silent support. Grant was seated at the defense table, flanked by attorneys who looked increasingly resigned, as though they knew the case was a losing battle. Jake approached the witness stand, wearing a neat button-down shirt. He took a shaky breath before speaking into the microphone, recounting the night he discovered the warehouse operation. He described, in detail, how he showed Grant Barber his phone, how Grant attacked him and left him for dead. When asked to identify the attacker, Jake pointed at Grant. "That's him," Jake said firmly. "He said my father was too nosy, and that he wasn't going to let me make the same mistake." A hush fell over the courtroom. Jake's tone was subdued, but every syllable carried raw emotion. He spoke of the betrayal, the fear, and the heartbreak of realizing that a man he once believed to be a friend was responsible for so much tragedy. The defense tried to discredit Jake's testimony, claiming inconsistencies in his story due to his head injury. Yet, cross-examination only reinforced Jake's sincerity. He remained calm, refusing to be rattled by the lawyer's attempts to poke holes in his account. Then the prosecutor brought in additional witnesses, survivors from the warehouses who recognized Grant as their tormentor. That sealed his fate. In the final statements, the prosecution laid out how Grant had murdered Officer Logan Carter when Logan got too close to exposing the trafficking ring. They highlighted the heartbreak inflicted on the Carter family, the trauma on the rescued victims, and the brazen betrayal of public trust by a sworn officer of the law. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, resolute in her condemnation, sentenced Grant Barber to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective exhale of relief seemed to pass through the courtroom. Reporters scurried outside to deliver the breaking news, and Angela held Jake in a tearful embrace. "You did it," she murmured, voice trembling. "You really did it." Jake, tears streaking his face, nodded. "We did it," he whispered. The aftermath of the trial brought both closure and a poignant sense of loss. The traffickers were dismantled. Additional arrests were made, ensuring that local corruption had less ground to thrive. FBI task forces extended beyond Havenport, using evidence from Grant's operation to trace other criminal elements and free remaining captives wherever possible. For Angela and Jake, life would never be the same. They mourned Logan, laying fresh flowers on his grave and speaking to him as though he could somehow hear them. They described how his sacrifice had not been in vain, that in the end, his son had helped complete the mission he died for. In the weeks that followed, the weight on Angela's chest grew lighter. She quit her job at the bakery to take some time for herself and for Jake. They shared long walks, trying to rediscover their bond now that the constant fear and uncertainty had passed. Jake returned to school part-time, greeted by classmates who had only heard bits and pieces of the ordeal. He wasn't ready to discuss everything, but he held his head a bit higher. He kept a small framed photo on his desk, a picture of him and his father fishing by the lake, a day of pure fun and laughter before the world grew dark. Sometimes he would stare at it, remembering Logan's unwavering sense of justice and how much he had wanted to keep Havenport safe. Jake felt a quiet pride that he had helped finish what his father started. A month after Grant's sentencing, Agent Price visited them at home, stepping inside the cozy living room. She set down a bundle of papers on the coffee table. "These are formal statements for both of you," she said, closing the case. "I wanted to personally say goodbye and thank you." Angela smiled, grateful. "You have no idea how much we appreciate what you've done. I don't think we could have survived this without you and your team." Price dipped her head. "We just did our job. You two are the real heroes here." Jake stepped forward. "Agent Price," he said quietly, "what's next for you?" She shrugged lightly. "We're following leads in a few other states. This ring wasn't limited to Havenport. But we've made a serious dent, thanks to you. Your father would be proud." A soft silence hung in the room before Price said her goodbyes and departed. Angela and Jake watched her leave, a sense of finality settling over them. This chapter of their lives, the heartbreak, the danger, and the quest for justice, was finally coming to a close. They walked out onto the porch, taking in the late afternoon sun. It felt different now, a warmth that promised a new beginning. Angela leaned on the railing, closing her eyes, remembering Logan's smile. She felt his spirit in the breeze, telling her it was okay to let go of the pain. Jake stood beside her, reflecting on how far they had come. "Mom," he said, voice soft, "do you think Dad's at peace now?" Angela blinked away tears, placing an arm around his shoulders. "I believe he is," she said. "And he's with us, every step of the way." They shared a quiet moment, gazing at the pink and orange streaks of sky. Though the sorrow never fully vanished, there was a renewed sense of purpose in their hearts. Angela resolved to live in a manner worthy of Logan's memory, fighting for what was right whenever she could. Jake, still young, carried a fierce determination to protect others from the injustices he had witnessed. Neither of them would ever forget the betrayals and triumphs of the past few months. Even as the sunset darkened into night, a gentle peace filled the Carter home. There would be rough days ahead, pangs of grief that surged unexpectedly when they saw Logan's empty chair at the kitchen table. But there would also be laughter, healing, and hope for the future. Several weeks later, Angela and Jake visited the local community center where a memorial plaque was dedicated to Officer Logan Carter. The plaque read, "In honor of those who serve with integrity and courage, protecting the vulnerable and seeking truth." Angela placed a small bouquet of flowers beneath it, and Jake stood in silence for a moment before bowing his head. They knew the healing journey wasn't over. It might never be. But for the first time since losing Logan, they felt that justice had prevailed. The man who betrayed them was behind bars, and the trafficking ring he enabled was exposed and broken. Countless innocent people were free. In the end, it was a victory rooted in the unwavering bond of their family, and the memory of a father who refused to let corruption rule his town. Jake turned to Angela with a faint smile. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She nodded, slipping an arm around his shoulders as they walked away from the plaque. The sun dipped low, casting golden light across the grass, as if to remind them that no matter how dark the world became, A new dawn would always follow. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.